first thing Mark noticed about the house was how far away the nearest light was. It wasn't the size of the property or the trees or even the long gravel driveway that disappeared between walls of bare oak and pitch pine. It was the absence of anything beyond it. From the second-floor bedroom, if you stood against the glass and looked through the branches toward the road, there was one yellow porch light belonging to a house nearly half a mile away. That was it. No traffic, no street lamps, no neighboring windows glowing through the trees, just darkness. They arrived in the Pine Barrens in early December, 3 days before the first hard freeze of the winter, with the moving truck still carrying half their furniture, and Sarah's hands cracked from unpacking cardboard boxes. The house had been cheap by suburban New Jersey standards, which was exactly why they bought it. Mark worked remotely for a software company and had spent the previous 5 years paying too much money to live 20 minutes from everything. Sarah illustrated children's books and advertising work from a studio she could set up almost anywhere. The listing had described the property as private, wooded, peaceful. Mark had laughed when he first read that. Private, wooded, peaceful, he told Sarah. That's realtor language for no one is coming if you scream. She had laughed too. Neither of them laughed when they saw the driveway. It was nearly a quarter mile from the county road to the house, narrow enough that branches scraped both sides of the moving truck. The house itself sat in a clearing surrounded on 3 sides by dense woods and on the 4th by an abandoned-looking access road that disappeared into the trees. The property bordered state forest land. There was a small detached shed, a covered porch, a basement with an exterior cellar entrance, and a crawl space beneath the older addition at the rear. It wasn't beautiful. It was practical. The windows had been replaced, the roof was new, and the previous owner had installed a modern electrical panel and a basic security system. Mark liked the locks. Sarah liked the light. By the end of their first night, they were exhausted enough not to care about anything else. Their first week passed without incident. Mark worked from the upstairs office with a headset on, attending meetings while the winter sky outside turned from gray to black before 5 o'clock. Sarah drew in the spare bedroom, which faced the woods. She complained about the lack of natural light, then admitted she liked being able to work without hearing lawn equipment, children, or traffic. They developed routines quickly. Mark locked the front and back doors every night. Sarah checked the windows before bed. They kept a flashlight beside the stairs and a heavy metal flashlight in the kitchen. Mark installed 2 additional motion cameras after discovering the existing system had blind spots near the side of the house. None of this was because they thought the woods were dangerous. It was simply what Mark did when he moved somewhere unfamiliar. He trusted systems more than instincts. On the 7th morning, Sarah found a dark brown smear on the white-painted porch rail. She noticed it while carrying a mug outside. At first, she thought it was mud. She wiped it with a paper towel and saw that it was exactly that. Wet, dark soil mixed with something that looked like pine needles. "Mark?" she called. He came downstairs. "What? Did you track mud onto the porch?" He looked at the smear. "Probably me. You didn't go outside yesterday." He paused. "Then you did." Sarah shook her head. She had been inside all day. Mark examined the ground beneath the railing. The soil there was frozen, but there was a soft patch near the steps where the drainage pipe emptied. He shrugged. "Animal?" Sarah asked. "Could be." They both knew what animal footprints looked like. There weren't any, but neither considered that significant. The woods were full of things they couldn't see. 3 nights later, the motion light beside the detached shed switched on at 3:07 in the morning. Mark woke because the bedroom briefly brightened. He checked a security application on his phone and saw the shed camera displaying a grainy black and white image of the side yard. The motion light was on. Nothing moved. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The light shut off. Sarah slept beside him. Mark stared at the screen for another minute and saw nothing. He assumed a deer had crossed the edge of the sensor without entering the camera's frame. In the morning, he found no tracks. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and the ground was hard. He mentioned it to Sarah over coffee. She looked at him. "You were watching the camera at 3 in the morning? The light woke me up. And? Nothing?" Then why are you telling me? Because you always say I never tell you anything. Sarah smiled. That's true. The subject disappeared. They had work to do. The next afternoon, Sarah went looking for a spare key they kept in a small ceramic bowl on the kitchen shelf. It wasn't there. She searched drawers, bags, coat pockets, the moving boxes they hadn't unpacked. Mark insisted he hadn't touched it. Sarah became annoyed because Mark had a habit of moving things when he cleaned. He denied it. They eventually found the key in the bottom drawer of the hallway console, beneath a stack of old receipts. Neither remembered putting it there. You did this, Sarah said. I didn't. You always do this. I absolutely did not. Fine. She took the key and put it back in the bowl. That should have been the end of it. But before she went upstairs, she looked at the key for several seconds. There was a tiny smear of black dirt around the ring. The first real winter storm came 2 days later. It wasn't heavy snow, just freezing rain followed by a night of hard wind. The trees around the property creaked continuously. At 11:40 p.m., Mark noticed a sound beneath the bedroom floor. It was faint enough that he almost ignored it. A dull scrape. Then silence. He sat upright. Sarah looked at him. What? Nothing. Another scrape. This time it sounded like something being dragged across wood. Mark got out of bed. Stay here. Sarah immediately sat up. No, I'm just checking downstairs. Then I'm coming. They walked down together. The house was silent. Mark switched on the hallway light. Nothing. He checked the kitchen, living room, basement stairs, and back door. All locked. The exterior security camera showed nothing except blowing rain. The sound didn't return. They went back upstairs. Sarah locked the bedroom door after them. Mark didn't comment. At 2:13 a.m., the shed motion light came on again. This time Mark was awake. He opened the camera feed. The image showed the side of the shed, the gravel path, and the tree line beyond it. The light had triggered, but nothing was visible. Mark increased the digital brightness. The woods remained empty. Then, for less than a second, the image changed. A vertical shape appeared at the extreme left edge of the frame. It was too dark to identify. Mark froze. The shape disappeared. He rewound the footage. The recording jumped backward. He played it again. The same thing happened. A narrow black shape entered the edge of the frame and vanished. Sarah. She opened her eyes. What? Look. She watched the clip. What is that? I don't know. Animal? Maybe. It looks like a person. Mark didn't answer. He replayed it again. This time, the shape wasn't visible. Compression artifact, he said. He didn't believe it. The next morning, Mark checked the camera physically. It was mounted 6 feet above the ground on the shed's corner, pointing toward the house. The lens was clean. The wiring was intact. The motion sensor was functioning normally. He walked around the shed and found nothing. At the edge of the property, he noticed a depression in the dead leaves beneath the trees. It looked like someone had sat there. There was a flattened section of leaves about the width of a human body. Mark stood over it for a long time. He told himself it was probably an animal bed. He had no reason to believe otherwise. He returned to the house and searched online for local wildlife. Deer, coyotes, foxes, black bears, bobcats. The list was long enough to make everything look ordinary. That afternoon, he adjusted the camera angles. He added a second camera facing the rear addition and another facing the cellar entrance. The cellar door was old metal with a horizontal latch. The previous owner had told him it was temperamental. Mark had already replaced the padlock. He considered adding another lock, but decided the existing setup was enough. That evening, Sarah asked him whether he had seen anything. No? Really? Really? She studied his face. You're lying. Mark sighed. I found a flattened spot in the woods. From what? Probably an animal. Probably? I don't know. Sarah put down her pencil. Mark, I'm not hiding anything from you. Then say what you're thinking. He hesitated. I think someone might have been around the property. She stared at him. Like a hunter? Maybe. Wouldn't we see a car? Not necessarily. Wouldn't they know this is private property? Maybe. Should we call someone? Mark shook his head. And tell them what? There's a patch of leaves in the woods? Sarah looked toward the window. The trees were motionless. I don't like this place anymore. Mark put his hand over hers. We'll be fine. For the next 5 days, nothing happened. That was almost worse. Fear is easier to dismiss when it has an event attached to it. A broken window, a footprint, a face at the end of a driveway. Instead, they had uncertainty. The house became a collection of sounds they couldn't categorize. Pipes clicking, the refrigerator compressor starting, wind pushing against the chimney, branches tapping the siding. Every sound had an explanation, and because every sound had an explanation, there was no single moment when they could justify being afraid. Mark began checking the security recordings each morning. He didn't tell Sarah. He watched the overnight footage at double speed while drinking coffee. Most of it showed nothing. Deer crossed the yard. A raccoon appeared near the shed. Wind moved branches. Once, a fox stopped in front of the cellar camera and stared directly into it. On the 8th night, the footage showed something strange again. At 3:01 a.m., the rear camera froze for approximately 4 seconds. The timestamp continued. The image did not. When it returned, there was a dark vertical shape near the tree line. Mark zoomed in. It looked like a person standing with their back against a tree. He checked the adjacent camera. Nothing. He checked the driveway camera. Nothing. He checked the shed camera. Nothing. The shape remained visible on the rear camera for exactly 11 seconds. Then it was gone. Mark exported the clip to his computer. He enhanced the contrast. The shape appeared more human. There was a suggestion of shoulders, a head, 2 legs, but the resolution was too poor to prove anything. He called the camera manufacturer. The support technician suggested network instability. If the camera is buffering, you can get frame persistence or compression artifacts, the technician said. Mark thanked him. He hung up and stared at the clip. He didn't tell Sarah. 2 days later, Sarah found another smear. This one was on the exterior cellar door. It was a brown handprint, incomplete and blurred by moisture. She called Mark from the kitchen. Come downstairs. He knew from her voice that something was wrong. When he saw the print, his first reaction was irritation. Could be yours. It isn't. Maybe the movers? They haven't been here in weeks. Could be from before we moved in. Then why is it wet? Mark crouched beside the door. The smear wasn't old. There was a faint outline of fingers. 5 marks. The palm was incomplete because something had rubbed across the surface afterward. He examined the latch. It was still locked. The padlock hadn't been disturbed. He checked the security footage from the previous night. Nothing. The cellar camera covered the door. At 2:58 a.m., the image showed the door. At 300, it showed the door. At 302, it showed the door. No person appeared. He opened the footage frame by frame. There was a 2-second gap at 3001. The timestamp jumped from 3001:42 to 3001:16. There, Sarah said. Mark looked at her. You see it? Yes, it's probably the camera. Then why does the handprint exist? He had no answer. He called the non-emergency police line. He described the situation without embellishment. Someone came out that afternoon. The officer walked the perimeter, checked the doors, and looked at the cameras. He was professional and calm. Any threats? He asked. No. Any confirmed entry? Mark shook his head. No. The officer looked toward the woods. Hunters come through here sometimes. Hikers too. This is private property. I know. He handed Mark a card. If you find evidence of someone entering the house, call us. Mark asked, what counts as evidence? The officer looked at the cellar door. Damage, footprints, something missing, someone inside. He paused. Until then, keep doing what you're doing. After the officer left, Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching his cruiser disappear down the driveway. He didn't believe us. Mark shook his head. He believed us. That's not what I mean. He can't arrest someone because we saw a weird camera glitch. I know. She turned around. "But you know what bothers me?" "What?" The officer said. "Until then." Mark didn't respond. That night they changed their routine. The curtains stayed closed. The exterior lights remained on. Mark moved the spare keys into a locked drawer. Sarah placed a chair under the basement door handle, something she later admitted was irrational because the door opened inward and the chair wouldn't actually stop someone strong enough. Mark didn't tell her. Instead, he installed a small contact sensor on the cellar door and configured the system to alert his phone if it opened. They went to bed at 10:30. At 1:17 a.m., Mark's phone vibrated. He opened his eyes immediately. The alert said, "Cellar door, open." He sat up. Sarah woke. "What?" "The cellar." They stared at each other. Mark grabbed the flashlight. Sarah took the heavy metal flashlight from the nightstand. They moved downstairs together. The house was dark except for the kitchen light they had left on. Mark checked the basement door. It was closed. He opened it. The basement smelled cold and damp. The cellar camera displayed the exterior door. It was shut. Maybe the sensor malfunctioned. Mark stepped onto the basement floor. He stopped. The outer cellar door was visible through the small basement window. The latch looked different. He walked to the window. "Mark," Sarah whispered. "Wait." He opened the basement door and stepped outside. The air was freezing. The gravel under his shoes cracked with every step. The cellar door was still closed, but the horizontal latch was lifted. Not broken, not damaged. Lifted. Mark stared at it. Sarah stood behind him. "How?" she whispered. He slowly lowered the latch. Then he noticed something else. The padlock was still attached, but it wasn't securing the latch. Someone had unbolted the internal mechanism from the other side and then reset it from outside in a way that made the door appear locked. Mark looked at Sarah. "We're going inside." "Why?" "Because whoever did this may still be here." Mark searched the basement first. He checked behind the furnace, under the stairs, around storage boxes, and inside the unfinished portion beneath the rear addition. Nothing. He opened the crawl space access panel. The flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. "Don't," Sarah said. He looked back. "If someone is in there, we need to know. We can call the police." Mark was already reaching for his phone. He called. While they waited, he kept the flashlight pointed toward the opening. There was insulation along the walls, old pipes overhead, and dirt beneath the addition. No movement, no breathing, no sound except the furnace. The police arrived 12 minutes later. 2 officers entered the basement. One went into the crawl space while the other checked the rest of the house. The crawl space was empty. They found no obvious footprints because the dirt was dry and covered with years of dust. One officer examined the latch. Could have been loose. Mark shook his head. The sensor triggered. Sensors fail. Someone touched it. The officer looked at him. Maybe. He checked the inside of the cellar door. There were scratches around the frame. Some were old, one was fresh. "You should replace the latch," he said, "and get a better camera." Mark asked whether they could search the woods. The officer looked toward the darkness beyond the glass. "We can walk the immediate area." They did. The beam of a flashlight moved between the trees. No one was found. Before leaving, the officer told them to call again if they saw anyone. Mark locked the cellar door with a new temporary chain. Then he and Sarah sat in the living room until sunrise. Neither slept. The next morning, Mark took the day off. He inspected every room, every window, every door, every lock. He checked the attic, basement, closets, crawl space, garage, and shed. Nothing appeared disturbed. Sarah watched him from the kitchen. "What are you looking for?" "Anything." "Like what?" "Something that shouldn't be here." She didn't answer. At noon, Mark found a scratch on the inside edge of the rear bedroom window. It was so small he almost missed it. The window had been locked from inside. The scratch wasn't evidence of entry. It could have been there before they moved in. He took a photograph anyway. Then he checked the security system logs. The strange gaps weren't random. They occurred mostly between 2055 and 3010 a.m. He pulled the recordings from all 4 cameras and lined them up on his monitor. The pattern became obvious. The driveway camera never went dark. The front porch camera never went dark. The shed camera occasionally dropped frames. The rear camera had repeated gaps, and every gap occurred when the rear camera should have had a clear view of the tree line. Mark sat back. Someone wasn't simply appearing in the footage. Someone was staying outside the camera's effective range. He opened the manufacturer settings and checked infrared sensitivity. The rear camera had a narrow field because a tree blocked part of it. Anyone standing behind that tree would be invisible, but they would still be close enough to watch the house. Mark zoomed into the nighttime footage. At 3004 on the previous night, a tiny reflection appeared between two branches. He enlarged it. It looked like an eye. He stared at it for almost a minute. Then he laughed quietly at himself. Jesus. Sarah came into the room. What? He minimized the screen. Nothing. You're doing that thing again. What thing? You're doing that thing again. What thing? You're deciding not to tell me because you think you'll scare me. Mark looked at her. I don't know what I'm seeing. Then let me decide whether I'm scared. He turned the monitor toward her. Sarah studied the enlarged image. She didn't speak for a long time. That looks like someone. Mark nodded. I know. What do we do? We're getting out of here for a few days. She looked relieved. Really? Yes. Good. He started making arrangements. They booked a hotel 40 minutes away and planned to leave after dark. Mark wanted to install another camera first. Sarah thought that was pointless. If someone is watching us, why are you giving them another night? Because if someone is watching us, I want to know from where. She stared at him. That is exactly the kind of thing people do in horror movies right before they die. We're not in a horror movie. He paused. We're in a house with a broken security system. That's not better. He smiled faintly. By sunset, he had installed a battery-powered camera facing the rear tree line from inside the upstairs window. It wasn't visible from outside. He also placed a small trail camera near the property boundary. Then he checked every door twice. They left the lights on. They drove away at 8:22 p.m. Mark watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. The woods swallowed it within seconds. At the hotel, Sarah finally relaxed enough to eat. Mark opened his laptop and checked the cameras remotely. The house looked empty. At 2047 a.m., the new interior camera captured movement outside the rear window. A dark figure stood between the trees. Mark woke Sarah. They watched together. The figure remained completely still for almost 3 minutes. Then it moved sideways behind the trunk of a pine and disappeared. There was no animal behavior, no wandering, no hesitation. It had been standing there deliberately. Sarah whispered, "That's a person." Mark nodded. "Yes, call the police." He did. Officers met them at the property at 40 at Nen in the morning. They searched the house first, then the yard. One officer examined the trail camera. It had captured footprints leading from the tree line toward the rear addition. The prints were partially obscured by frozen leaves, but they were clearly human. The officer followed them with a flashlight. They ended near the crawlspace access. He looked back at Mark. "You've been inside this crawlspace?" "Yes." "Recently?" 2 days ago." "Did you notice anything?" "No." The officer crouched. There was a small gap beneath the access panel. He shone the flashlight inside. Something was visible against the dirt. A blanket, old, dark, folded into a narrow bundle. Mark's stomach dropped. "What is that?" The officer didn't answer. He reached inside with a gloved hand and pulled the blanket toward him. Beneath it were empty food wrappers, 2 plastic water bottles, a cheap flashlight, and a stack of newspapers. Sarah covered her mouth. The officer looked at the second officer. "We have a problem." They expanded the search. The crawl space wasn't empty. It contained a small depression in the insulation, enough to suggest someone had been lying there. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. They led toward the rear wall, where the crawl space opened slightly beneath the addition. Mark realized what he was looking at. Someone had been living underneath their house. Not for a night, not for a few hours, long enough to build a routine. The police searched the woods until dawn. They found more evidence about 30 yards behind the property. A plastic storage container was buried beneath branches. Inside were canned food, bottled water, blankets, batteries, and several photographs. The photographs were not of the woods, they were of the house. The first showed the exterior from a distance. The second showed the porch. The third showed Sarah carrying a box inside on moving day. Mark recognized the coat she was wearing. The photograph had been taken before they had finished unpacking. Another showed Mark leaving for the grocery store. Another showed Sarah sitting at her upstairs desk. There were dozens. Some were printed photographs. Others were screenshots from what appeared to be a camera or phone. One photograph showed Mark standing in the kitchen. The angle was wrong. It looked as though the photograph had been taken from inside the house. Sarah began crying. Mark couldn't move. The officer took the photographs as evidence. "Do you recognize this person?" he asked. Mark shook his head. "No," Sarah whispered. "I've never seen him." The officer nodded. "Don't go back inside until we finish the search." They spent the morning outside while investigators processed the property. Every room was checked again. The crawl space was measured. The cellar was examined. A loose section of insulation behind the furnace revealed a narrow gap leading into the crawl space. From there, someone could reach the underside of the rear floor. Mark stood in the basement looking upward. The house suddenly seemed transparent. Every creak, every movement, every time they thought they were alone. There had been a person beneath them. The investigators found no evidence that the intruder had entered through a forced door. Instead, they found the original weakness. The exterior cellar door could be opened from inside the basement by releasing the latch. The intruder had apparently been using it at night. He could enter the basement, move through the crawl space, and leave without touching the main doors. The security cameras were positioned to protect the house from outside threats, but the blind spot was directly beside the crawl space entrance. Mark asked the investigator how long they thought the person had been there. Hard to say. Days, possibly weeks. Weeks. The bedding and food suggest extended occupation. Sarah looked at Mark. "We were sleeping upstairs." Sarah looked at Mark. "We were sleeping upstairs." Mark nodded. "I know." He couldn't stop thinking about the sounds beneath the floor. The scrape, the footsteps, the tiny noises he had explained away. They hadn't been noises. They had been someone moving. The officer returned from the woods with another bag. Inside was a cheap pair of binoculars, a thermos, and a notebook. Mark saw the notebook from several feet away. It contained dates and times. The investigator flipped through it. "We're going to need to review this." Mark didn't ask what was written. He didn't want to know. But later, one of the officers told them there were entries describing their routines. Mark's work schedule, Sarah's drawing hours, the time they went to bed, the time Mark left for groceries, the time Sarah walked to the mailbox. It wasn't random observation. It was surveillance. By afternoon, detectives had identified a possible suspect. He had no fixed address and had been reported as a transient in several nearby areas. They didn't know if the identification was confirmed. They asked Mark and Sarah to stay somewhere else. Mark agreed immediately. They packed essentials under police supervision. Sarah refused to enter the bedroom alone. Mark carried her bags. Before leaving, he stood in the upstairs hallway and looked toward the rear window. The woods were still. Snow had begun to fall lightly. For a moment, he thought he saw someone between the trees. He stared. Nothing. "Mark," Sarah called. He turned. They walked out together. The property was supposed to feel safe again because the police had found the explanation. But knowing the explanation made everything worse. There had never been a ghost. There had never been anything supernatural. There had been a man hiding beneath their house. A man who knew their routines. A man who could hear them moving overhead. A man who had watched them sleep. They spent the next 2 nights at Sarah's sister's house. The police contacted them twice. The suspect had not been found. His belongings suggested he knew the area well. The detectives believed he had used abandoned structures and wooded areas as temporary shelters for months. They advised Mark and Sarah not to return until the property was secured. Mark asked about cameras. They were replacing them. Locks, replaced. Crawl space, sealed. Cellar, reinforced. Every vulnerability was being addressed. But there was one thing nobody could replace: the feeling that the house had already been occupied by someone else. 3 days later, Mark insisted on returning during daylight to collect more clothes. Sarah didn't want to go, but she went with him. The police had cleared the property. The suspect still hadn't been found. The driveway looked different in daylight. They could see the distance between the house and the road more clearly. They could see how easily someone could stand among the trees without being noticed. Mark parked near the front door. Sarah waited while he checked the house. Every room was empty. The crawl space had been sealed with heavy mesh. The cellar door had a new steel latch. New cameras had been installed around the exterior. Motion lights covered the rear yard. It should have felt secure. Instead, the house felt violated. Sarah walked into the bedroom and stopped. "What's wrong?" Mark asked. She pointed toward the wall. There was a small scratch near the baseboard. Mark crouched. It was nothing, just a scratch. But beside it was a narrow strip of dark dirt. He looked toward the crawl space, probably from the investigation. Sarah nodded, though neither believed it. They gathered their clothes. Mark went downstairs. He checked the kitchen, then the basement, then the cellar. Everything was locked. He returned upstairs. Sarah was standing by the rear window. "Look!" She pointed outside. A footprint was visible in the thin snow beneath the window. Mark stared. The footprint was fresh. It faced the house. There was only one. No trail leading toward it. No trail leading away. Just a single human footprint beneath the window. Mark's first thought was that it could belong to a detective. But the investigators had worn boots with deep patterned soles. This print was narrower, almost smooth. He didn't tell Sarah what he was thinking. He closed the curtains. They left immediately. Mark called the detective from the driveway. The detective told him they would send someone to inspect the footprint. They waited in the car. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Sarah stared at the woods. "Do you think he's still here?" Mark kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know." "That's not what I asked." Mark didn't answer. The police arrived. They photographed the print and followed the direction of the toe. It led toward the woods, but after several yards, the snow disappeared beneath the trees. There was no trail. The detective returned to the car. "Could be from one of our people." Mark said, "No." The detective looked at him. "You don't know that. I know the pattern of your boots. You checked." "Yes." The detective sighed. "Mark, we're doing everything we can. I know. The suspect may have left the area. May have. We don't have him." That sentence stayed with Mark. They drove away again. That night, he couldn't sleep. At 3:03 a.m., his phone received a security notification from the house. A camera had detected motion. Mark opened the feed. The rear yard was empty. The timestamp showed 3003. The image remained still. Then, at the very edge of the infrared range, something moved. Mark enlarged the image. A shoulder. Maybe. The figure was standing behind a tree. It wasn't approaching. It was watching. Mark woke Sarah. She looked at the screen. "Call them." Mark called the detective. The detective asked him to stay on the line. While they waited, the figure moved. It stepped backward into darkness. The camera captured nothing else. The detective told them not to return. Mark didn't sleep that night. He watched the camera feed until sunrise. At 6:12, a deer entered the yard. At 6:28, the motion light turned off. At 7004, nothing. At 7:45, the detective called. "We're going back to the property." Mark asked whether they had found the suspect. "No." "Then what are you looking for?" A pause. "The camera footage." "Why?" Another pause. "The camera footage." "Why?" Another pause. "Because we noticed something in the background." Mark felt cold despite the heated room. "What?" "The figure appears to know where the camera is." The detective explained that in every clip, the person remained just beyond the infrared range. He wasn't wandering through the yard. He was positioning himself where the cameras couldn't see him. "He's learned the camera layout," the detective said. "Or he already knew it." Mark closed his eyes. He was living under the house. "We know." So he knew the camera locations. That's possible. Mark looked at Sarah. How did he get out? The detective didn't answer immediately. That's what we're trying to determine. They returned to the property with a search team. Mark watched remotely as officers walked through the house. One officer opened the basement access, another inspected the crawl space, a third walked the tree line. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. Then one of the officers called the others toward the rear addition. They had found another opening beneath the house. It was narrow, hidden behind a fallen section of wooden lattice. It led from the crawl space into the woods. Mark stared at the screen. He had another exit. The opening was barely visible from the yard. Someone small could crawl through it without disturbing the surrounding vegetation. Inside the tunnel were cigarette butts, food wrappers, and footprints. The passage ended beneath a cluster of pine trees nearly 50 yards from the house. The detective followed it and found another campsite. There was a sleeping bag, a folding chair, and a small battery-powered radio. The site had a direct line of sight to the house. From the chair, someone could watch the rear windows for hours. The detective called Mark. You were right. Mark didn't feel relieved. About what? He wasn't just hiding here. What was he doing? Watching. Mark looked at Sarah. How long? We don't know. Weeks? Maybe longer. Mark's voice became quiet. He could see us through the windows. The detective said nothing. Mark knew the answer. The photographs had already told them. The notebook had told them. The cameras had told them. Still, hearing it made his stomach tighten. Sarah whispered, I want to sell the house. Mark nodded. We will. They began the process that afternoon. The house was listed immediately, but Mark refused to go back. A security company was hired to monitor it. The police continued searching. The suspect's name circulated among investigators, but they couldn't locate him. He had no stable residence, no reliable phone, and apparently knew the surrounding forest extremely well. The detective told Mark they had reason to believe he had been staying in the area for some time. He also told him something else. Don't assume he's gone just because we haven't seen him. That sentence became the reason Mark couldn't let go. He started reviewing every camera recording they had, not because he wanted to find the suspect, because he wanted to understand how long the man had been there. He went back through the footage from the day they moved in. At first, nothing. The moving truck arrived. They unloaded boxes. Sarah carried a lamp inside. Mark walked back and forth. The footage was boring. Then Mark noticed something. At 6:18 p.m., while they were inside carrying furniture, the rear camera recorded movement near the trees. He slowed the footage. A figure crossed behind a pine. He stopped the video. It was barely visible. He checked the timestamp. They hadn't known anyone was there. He went further back. The day before they moved in, a figure appeared again. The day before that, another movement. Mark realized the person hadn't arrived after them. He had already been there. Maybe the house hadn't been chosen because they were there. Maybe they had unknowingly moved into a place the man already considered his. Mark continued reviewing. On the second night they slept there, a shadow passed beneath the rear window. On the fourth night, the shed motion light activated. On the seventh, the spare key disappeared. On the ninth, the camera gap occurred. The pattern was there from the beginning. They had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Sarah eventually found Mark at the dining table, surrounded by printed photographs and camera screenshots. What are you doing? He didn't answer immediately. I think he was here before us. She looked at the images. How long? I don't know. Why didn't he hurt us? Mark stared at the photograph. Maybe he didn't want to. That's not comforting. I know. Then why are you trying to understand him? Mark rubbed his eyes, because if I understand what he wanted, I can understand what he'll do next. Sarah sat down. What do you think he wanted? Mark looked toward the dark window. Access, shelter, a place where nobody noticed him. And us? We were noise. Just noise? Mark didn't answer. Sarah looked at the photographs again. One showed her standing at the kitchen counter. Another showed Mark walking through the yard. A third showed them sitting together on the porch. He watched us. Mark nodded. Every day. That's not a person you can predict. No, he gathered the papers. That's why we're not going back. They thought that was the end. It wasn't. The following week, the security company contacted Mark at 3016 in the morning. The house alarm had been triggered, not the exterior cameras, not the cellar sensor, the main interior alarm. Someone had opened a door inside the house. Mark stared at his phone. The property was empty. The new security system had been activated. The company operator told him police were already being dispatched. Mark woke Sarah. Someone's inside. She sat up instantly. What? The alarm. They listened to the operator through speakerphone. We have officers en route. Mark asked which door. The operator checked. Rear hallway. Sarah whispered, that's impossible. Mark felt his mouth go dry. The crawl space. What? The rear hallway is above the crawl space. The operator said, Sir, officers are arriving now. Mark watched the remote camera feed. The rear hallway was dark. Nothing moved. Then the camera flickered. One frame showed a shape standing at the end of the hall. Mark froze. The image returned to normal. Did you see that? Sarah whispered. Yes, the operator said. What did you see? Mark didn't answer. The police arrived at the property. Their body cameras transmitted no live feed to Mark, but the security operator stayed on the line. Officers entered through the front door. They moved room by room. Nothing. The alarm log showed the rear hallway door had opened for exactly 4 seconds. The door was now closed. The officers checked it. Locked. They checked the basement. Empty. Crawl space. Empty. The exterior cameras showed no one leaving. The detective called Mark afterward. We don't know what triggered it. Mark said someone was inside. The detective sighed. We can't confirm that. Mark looked at Sarah. You know what the problem is, he said quietly. What? He doesn't need to break in. Sarah stared at him. Why? Mark's face had gone pale. Because he already knows how to get inside. They moved out permanently 2 days later. The house went on the market. Mark refused to spend another night there. Sarah packed everything she could. The security company kept the system active. The police continued investigating. The suspect remained missing. For several weeks, nothing happened. Mark started sleeping normally again. Sarah began drawing again. They found an apartment in a more populated area where they could see traffic from the bedroom window. Mark hated the noise. He didn't care. Noise meant other people. Other people meant witnesses. One evening, almost a month after they left the Pine Barrens house, Mark received an email from the security company. It contained a routine incident report. He almost deleted it. Then he saw the timestamp, 30,002 a.m. He opened the attached photograph. It showed the empty rear yard of the old house. Snow covered the ground. The trees were black against the night sky. At the edge of the image, behind the same pine tree that had caused the camera blind spot, stood a person. The figure was facing the house. Mark zoomed in. The image was grainy. The person appeared to be wearing a dark coat and a knit cap. Mark stared at the screen. Then he noticed something that made his chest tighten. The figure wasn't looking toward the house. It was looking directly at the camera. Mark enlarged the image again. The face was mostly shadow, but there was enough detail to see that the person knew exactly where the lens was. Mark forwarded the photograph to the detective. The detective called within minutes. Where did you get this? The security company. When was it taken? Last night. There was silence. Then the detective said, Don't go anywhere. Mark looked at Sarah. Why? The detective answered quietly. Because we just found something. The detective sent Mark a photograph from the original investigation. It showed the hidden campsite behind the pine trees. Mark recognized the folding chair. The same chair appeared in the new security image. But that wasn't the important part. On the ground beside the chair was a small wooden box. Investigators had assumed it contained personal items. They had never opened it because it was empty. The detective told Mark they had gone back to the property after receiving the new image. The box was gone. Mark stared at his screen. He came back. We think so. Why? Because something else is missing. What? The notebook. Mark felt the room become strangely quiet. The detective continued. We recovered photographs. We recovered supplies. We recovered some notes. But the main notebook was never found. Mark remembered the officer mentioning it. Dates, times, routines. He had assumed it had been taken into evidence. You never had it? He asked. No. Then where is it? That's what we're trying to determine. Sarah looked at Mark. What did he write? Mark told her. She went pale. Our routines? Yes. Everything? We don't know. The detective asked Mark whether anyone had contacted him since leaving the house. Mark said no. The detective told him to keep his doors locked and call if anything seemed unusual. Then the line went dead. That night, Mark installed a camera facing the hallway of their apartment. Sarah didn't argue. They locked the doors. They checked the windows. Mark inspected the balcony. Everything was normal. At 20:56 a.m., they went to bed. At 3:00, Mark woke without knowing why. He listened. The apartment was silent. No wind, no trees, no gravel, no branches against the walls. Just the low hum of the refrigerator. He reached for his phone. The screen showed no alerts. Sarah was asleep. Mark stared at the ceiling. Then he heard it. A faint metallic sound from the hallway. Click. He sat up. Click. The front door handle moved slightly. Mark's heart began pounding. He reached for the phone and opened the hallway camera. The image loaded. The hallway was empty. The front door was closed. Mark watched. Nothing. Then the handle moved again, slowly, almost carefully. Mark froze. He woke Sarah without speaking. She saw his face and immediately understood. They sat together in the dark. The handle stopped moving. 30 seconds passed. 1 minute. Nothing. Mark called the police. While he waited, he kept watching the camera. At the far end of the hallway, near the coat closet, a shadow appeared. It was so subtle that Mark thought the camera had malfunctioned. Then the shadow moved, not toward the door, toward the camera. Sarah gripped his arm. Mark whispered, "Don't move." The shadow stopped. The screen flickered. For 1 second, the hallway camera showed a close-up of a human face. Then the feed went black. The apartment remained silent. Mark could hear his own breathing. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street. Its headlights moved across the ceiling. The police arrived 4 minutes later. They found no one in the apartment. The front door was still locked. The hallway was empty. The camera had restarted itself. There was no usable recording of the face. But when the officers checked the door, they found something beneath the handle. A thin smear of dark soil. Mark stared at it. He knew that soil. Pine Barrens soil. The same dark mud from the porch of the house they had left weeks ago. And for the first time since this began, Mark understood the one thing he had been refusing to consider. The house hadn't been the source of the danger. It had only been the place where the danger had been easiest to hide. Someone had learned their routines there. Someone had learned their routines there. Someone had followed them when they left. And somewhere in the darkness, outside their new apartment, beyond the range of the hallway camera, there was a person who already knew exactly what time they usually went to sleep. Mark didn't sleep after the police left. He sat on the edge of the bed with the apartment lights on, staring at the dark hallway camera feed while Sarah remained beside him under a blanket, her eyes fixed on the front door. The officers had searched the apartment twice. They had checked the hallway, stairwell, parking area, fire escape, utility closet, and the basement storage level. They had found no one. The soil beneath the door handle had been photographed and collected, but the officers couldn't tell them where it came from. Mark knew he didn't need a laboratory. He had spent weeks looking at the same reddish-black dirt around the old house. It contained fine sand, pine needles, and the unmistakable dark color of the Pine Barrens. Their new apartment was nearly 50 miles away. There was no reason for that dirt to be on their door. At least, there wasn't supposed to be. "We're leaving," Sarah said. Mark looked at her. "Where?" "A hotel." "Again?" "I don't care." He looked toward the hallway. "If he's here, a hotel won't fix anything." "Then what do you suggest?" Mark had no answer. The police had told them the building was secure. The front entrance required a key fob. The elevators required access after certain hours. There were cameras in the lobby and parking garage. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no easy way for someone to enter without being recorded. But Mark had already learned the lesson the hard way. Cameras didn't make a place secure. They only made you feel like you could see what was happening. "We stay," he finally said. Sarah stared at him. "You're serious? For tonight? Why?" "Why? Because if we keep running every time something happens, we'll never know whether we're actually safe." She looked at the hallway camera. "And if we're not?" Mark swallowed. "Then I want to know." The next morning, the detective called. He told Mark the soil sample was consistent with the area around their previous property, but that didn't prove the suspect had placed it there. Mark asked whether they had found any sign of the man at the old house. The answer was no. The detective said they had checked the surrounding forest, abandoned cabins, drainage roads, and several temporary camps. Nothing. Mark asked the question that had been bothering him since the night before. "Did you find his vehicle?" The detective paused. "No." "So how did he follow us?" "We don't know that he did." "Then how do you explain the dirt?" "We don't." Mark closed his eyes. "What about the photographs? What about them? Did you find any photos of our new apartment?" Another pause. This one lasted longer. "No." "You're hesitating." "Because I'm reviewing the evidence as we speak." "Did you find anything?" The detective sighed. "One of the recovered memory cards was damaged. We're trying to recover it." Mark's stomach tightened. "When will you know?" "We don't." Mark looked at Sarah. She was watching him. "Call me when you do." The detective agreed. Before hanging up, he said something that Mark would remember later. "If you notice anything unusual, don't investigate it yourself." Mark almost laughed. "I won't." He hung up. Sarah asked, "What did he say?" "Nothing useful." "That's becoming a pattern." Mark nodded. "Yeah, they changed everything." Mark replaced the apartment's door lock with a high-security cylinder after obtaining permission from the landlord. He added a door contact alarm and a secondary interior bar. He placed a camera inside the entryway and another facing the stairwell through the peephole area. Sarah stopped working beside the windows. The curtains stayed closed after sunset. Neither of them went outside alone. Mark contacted his employer and told them he would be working from a private office for the next several days. Sarah canceled 2 appointments. Their lives narrowed around the apartment. It was strange how quickly fear could turn a home into a bunker. Every normal sound became a question. Footsteps in the hallway. An elevator stopping on their floor. Someone laughing outside. A car door closing in the parking lot. Mark knew logically that most of these things meant nothing, but logic had become less comforting. The problem wasn't that they had seen something impossible. The problem was that everything was possible. On the 4th night, Mark noticed something on the building's security feed. At 2:58 a.m., the parking garage camera showed a man entering through the pedestrian door. The image was distant, but Mark could see a dark jacket, dark pants, and a knit cap. The man stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't walk toward the elevators. He stood still. Then he looked directly at the camera. Mark rewound the clip. The man had entered from outside without a vehicle. He remained there for nearly 30 seconds. Then he walked out. Mark called building security. The guard checked the recording. "Do you recognize him?" Mark asked. "No." "Can you check the door access?" The guard did. No key fob registered. Mark stared at the screen. "Then how did he get in?" The guard said the pedestrian door occasionally failed to latch. "We're fixing it." Mark almost said, "You need to fix it now." Instead, he asked for a copy of the footage. The guard refused without a police request. Mark called the detective. The detective arrived the following afternoon. He watched the footage several times. "Can you enhance the face?" he asked. Mark did. The image became grainier. The man was facing away from the light. His face remained hidden. "Could be him," the detective said. "Could be anyone." Mark looked at him. "You don't believe me." "That's not what I said." "You think we're seeing him everywhere." "I think you're scared." Mark nodded. "I am." The detective didn't argue. He leaned back. Fear can make patterns out of random events. Mark said nothing, but the detective continued. You've had more than enough unusual events that I'm not going to dismiss your concerns. Sarah entered the room carrying 2 mugs. The detective looked at her. Have you noticed anything else? She hesitated. I found something yesterday. She placed her phone on the table. It showed a photograph of the building's rear service entrance. On the pavement was a small object, a piece of folded paper. What's that? The detective asked. I found it outside our window. What does it say? Sarah enlarged the photograph. The paper had been folded in half. On the outside, written in pencil, were 2 words. Still awake? The detective's expression changed. He stood immediately. Where is the paper? Sarah said. I threw it away. Where? She pointed toward the kitchen trash. The detective put on gloves and searched through the bin. He found the paper beneath coffee grounds. He unfolded it. The inside was blank. No fingerprints, no message, no useful evidence. But the handwriting looked uneven and deliberate. Mark stared at it. He knows we're awake. The detective looked at him. Or someone wants you to think he does. Mark didn't care which possibility was worse. That night, the detective arranged for an officer to sit in an unmarked vehicle outside the building. Mark knew about it. Sarah didn't. She had finally fallen asleep around midnight. Mark stayed awake at his desk. At 2:33 a.m., he checked the exterior camera. The parking lot was empty. At 2051, the officer's vehicle remained outside. At 2058, nothing. At 3:58, nothing. At 3, the hallway camera briefly flickered. Mark's body went rigid. He opened the live feed. The hallway was empty. He checked the front door sensor. Closed. Window sensors. Closed. Balcony door. Closed. He looked at the camera again. Something was wrong. The image looked slightly different. Mark zoomed in. There was a dark vertical line beside the coat closet. He walked toward the hallway. Mark? Sarah called from the bedroom. He stopped. Stay there. What's happening? Nothing. He hated saying that word. He took his flashlight and moved slowly. The line disappeared as he approached. It was only the edge of a coat hanging from the closet. Mark exhaled. He almost laughed. Then he noticed the closet door was open. They never left it open. He stood there staring. Sarah came out of the bedroom. What? Mark raised a finger. They both listened. Nothing. He opened the closet fully. Jackets, shoes, boxes. No one. He checked the floor. Dust. Just nothing. Then he noticed the back wall. There was a narrow gap between the closet panel and the wall. It wasn't large enough for a person, but there was fresh dirt along the edge. Mark crouched. Sarah whispered, "No." He touched the dirt. It was damp, cold. He stood. "We're leaving." This time Sarah didn't argue. The police searched the apartment before sunrise. They removed the closet panel. Behind it was a utility chase running vertically between floors. It contained electrical conduit and old plumbing. It was too narrow for a person. But there was another opening farther down, behind a removable access panel. The detective stared at it. Could someone get in through this? Mark asked. Not from the apartment. From where? The detective didn't answer. He called building management. The chase connected to a maintenance corridor in the basement. That corridor connected to an older section of the building that had been sealed years earlier. Mark felt his stomach drop. The detective ordered a search. They found no one, but they found something else. A sleeping bag, a plastic bottle, a small flashlight, and a stack of food wrappers. Someone had been using the maintenance area. The detective looked at Mark. "This doesn't prove it's your guy." Mark said, "No." He looked down at the sleeping bag. "It proves someone has been here." The detective nodded. "Yes." Sarah whispered, "We need to leave." The detective agreed. "You should." They went to a hotel again. This time, the detective arranged for them to stay somewhere undisclosed. Mark packed only clothing in his laptop, Sarah took her sketchbooks. They left the apartment before sunrise. Mark looked back at the hallway camera one last time. The feed showed nothing, but he couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the parking garage. He wondered whether the man had followed them from the Pine Barrens or whether they had simply moved into another place where someone already knew how to hide. The detective said the latter was possible. Old buildings had forgotten spaces. People disappeared into them. Squatters moved through utility areas, abandoned structures, and construction sites. A person who knew how to survive unnoticed didn't need supernatural abilities. They needed patience, and the man from the woods had plenty of it. At the hotel, Mark finally received the call he had been waiting for. The detective had recovered part of the damaged memory card. Mark listened silently as the detective described what it contained. "There are images," he said, "from the house?" "Some." "What else?" "Your car." Mark felt cold. "What?" "The card contains several photographs of your vehicle." "Before we moved?" "Yes." "How?" The detective paused. "The earliest image is from 6 weeks before you bought the house." Mark remembered that period. He and Sarah had been looking at properties. They had visited the house twice before purchasing it. On one of those visits, Sarah had taken photographs of the backyard. Mark had never noticed anyone. The detective continued. "There are also photographs of your previous apartment." Mark stood up. "That's impossible." "I know." "How long?" "The date suggests the person was watching you before you moved." Sarah looked at Mark. He couldn't speak. The detective said, "We're going to send you copies." "Do it." "There's one more thing." Mark waited. The final image was taken after you left the Pine Barrens. Mark's throat tightened. "When?" "The day you moved into the apartment." Mark looked at Sarah. "Where?" "Outside the building," Mark whispered. "So he followed us." The detective answered, "It appears that way." The photograph arrived 10 minutes later. Mark opened it. It showed their moving van parked outside the apartment building. Sarah was carrying a box. Mark was standing beside the van. The image had been taken from across the street. The angle was partially obscured by a tree. Mark stared at it. The date was correct. The time was correct. The person who took the photograph had been there while they were unloading. Then Mark noticed something in the lower corner. A parked vehicle. An old dark sedan. He recognized it. He had seen it near the house. It had been parked on the county road the day they moved in. At the time, he assumed it belonged to a hunter. He zoomed in. The license plate was partially visible. The detective had already run it. It was registered to a woman who had reported the car stolen 3 years earlier. The detective told Mark the vehicle had never been recovered. "How did he get it?" Mark asked. "We don't know." "Where is it now?" "We found it abandoned behind a closed gas station yesterday." Mark looked at Sarah. "Was there anything inside?" "Yes." The detective hesitated. "A map." "Of what?" "Your new apartment building." Mark felt the room spin slightly. "What about the old house?" "It was marked too." "And the route between them?" The detective was silent. Mark already knew. The map showed the exact roads between their old house and the apartment. It included rest stops, gas stations, wooded pull-offs, and small access roads. Someone had planned the journey. The detective believed the suspect had been following them by car. That explained how he had arrived so quickly. It didn't explain how he had entered the apartment building without being recorded. But the maintenance corridors did. He had likely found another hidden access route and used it to enter the building. The detective warned Mark that they should not return to the apartment until the entire building had been searched. Mark agreed. Sarah asked whether the suspect had ever spoken to them. The detective said no. "Then why?" she asked. "Why would someone watch us for so long?" The detective didn't know. Mark thought about the photographs, the notebook, the chair in the woods, the blanket under their house. The man had never attacked them. He had watched. He had studied. He had learned. Maybe the watching itself was the point. The hotel became another temporary prison. Mark began noticing the same pattern again. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the hallway outside their room would become silent. The normal hotel noises stopped. No elevator, no footsteps, No doors, just silence. On the third night, Mark heard footsteps anyway. Slow, heavy. Someone walked past their door. Mark checked the people. The hallway was empty. He waited. The footsteps returned. They came from the opposite direction this time. He checked again. Nothing. Then he noticed the peephole itself had been partially covered from the outside. Something dark was pressed against it. Mark stepped back. Sarah woke. What? He pointed. She saw the darkness. They called the front desk. Security arrived within minutes. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The dark spot disappeared when the guard approached. He examined the peephole. There was a small smear of dirt on the glass. Mark stared at it. The guard apologized. He assumed someone had brushed against it. Mark didn't argue. He knew what it meant. They moved again. This time the detective placed them in a safe location connected to law enforcement. Mark couldn't stop thinking about the man. Not because he feared being killed. Because he didn't understand why he hadn't been attacked. If the man wanted them gone, there had been opportunities. He could have entered their house while they slept. He could have sabotaged their car. He could have attacked them in the woods. He had done none of those things. He had remained close, hidden, observing. That suggested a purpose. The detective eventually came to the same conclusion. We're looking at behavior, he told Mark, not motive. What's the difference? Motive tells us why. Behavior tells us what he is likely to do. And what is he likely to do? Stay close. Mark stared at him. Until when? Until something changes. Sarah asked, what changes? The detective looked at her. You notice him. Silence filled the room. Mark understood. The entire strategy depended on remaining unseen. Once discovered, he might leave, or he might react. 2 days later, the suspect made his first mistake. A convenience store camera captured him buying food. The detective sent Mark a still image. The man was older than Mark expected, perhaps late 40s or early 50s. Thin, hollow cheeks, gray stubble, dark knit cap. He looked tired rather than monstrous. There was nothing remarkable about him. That was the worst part. He looked like someone who could stand in a line beside you and disappear into a crowd. The detective identified him as a man who had spent years moving between temporary shelters and abandoned properties. He had been reported missing by a relative several years earlier, but was never formally located. He had no stable employment and almost no digital footprint. The detective believed he had become increasingly paranoid and isolated. Mark asked whether he had a history of violence. Some minor incidents. How minor? Trespassing, theft, one assault years ago, and now we don't know. The detective emphasized the last part. They were dealing with someone who had avoided detection for a long time. The man wasn't necessarily looking for violence, but desperation could change behavior. The detective set up surveillance around the store. They waited. The suspect didn't return. He vanished again. Mark began to think he might never be found. Then Sarah noticed something in the photograph. Mark. He looked. She pointed toward the man's hand. He was holding a small notebook. Mark's heart sank. That's it. What? The notebook. The detective confirmed it. The original surveillance notebook had not been recovered. The suspect still had it. The man wasn't simply hiding. He was carrying the record of everything he knew about them. Their routines, their movements, their fears, their habits. Mark asked the detective whether they could track him through the notebook. Maybe. How? If we know what he writes, we might predict where he goes. Mark thought about the entries they had seen. Times, places, patterns. Then use us. The detective looked at him. What do you mean? If he watches routines, give him a routine. Sarah immediately shook her head. No. Mark looked at her. We can't keep hiding forever. That's exactly what we should do. He'll keep watching. Let him. And if he enters again, Sarah's voice broke. Then what? Mark had no answer. The detective told them not to attempt anything themselves. He would handle it. They created a controlled routine. Mark returned to work from a temporary office. Sarah began visiting a public art studio. Police watched from a distance. They deliberately maintained predictable movements while quietly changing the actual details. Mark left the building at the same time every morning but used different routes. Sarah appeared to go to the studio, but entered through a side entrance. The goal was to see whether someone reacted. For 4 days, nothing happened. On the 5th morning, Mark saw the same dark sedan parked 3 blocks away. The detective confirmed it was connected to the suspect. Mark didn't approach it. Police surrounded the area. The sedan was empty. Inside, they found a backpack containing food, water, clothing, batteries, and a photograph of Sarah entering the studio. The photograph had been taken that morning. The suspect was nearby, very nearby. They searched the surrounding buildings. Nothing. Then a patrol officer noticed an unlocked service door behind a laundromat. It led to a basement. The basement contained old pipes, storage rooms, and a narrow tunnel connecting to an adjacent building. The suspect had been using the tunnel. They found his sleeping bag. They found food. They found another camera, and they found a small radio tuned to a local police frequency. He had been listening to them, but there was no sign of him. The detective told Mark he was becoming more concerned. He's adapting. Mark asked what that meant. Every time we close one route, he finds another, Sarah said. Then he'll keep doing it. The detective nodded. Unless we catch him. They nearly did. 3 nights later, Mark received an alert from the apartment security system. The apartment had been left vacant under police supervision, but the cameras were still active. Motion detected. Rear hallway. Mark watched from the secure location. The image showed the hallway, empty. Then a shadow moved across the wall. Someone stepped into view. The suspect. He was wearing the same dark coat. He stopped in front of the camera. He looked directly at it. Then he raised one hand, not waving, holding something, a photograph. He placed it against the wall beneath the camera. Then he stepped backward. Mark leaned toward the screen. The photograph was too small to identify. The suspect turned and walked toward the bedroom. Mark called the detective. Police entered the building within minutes, but by the time they reached the apartment, the suspect was gone. The photograph remained. It showed Mark and Sarah standing on the porch of the Pine Barrens house on their first morning there. They were smiling. Sarah was holding a mug. Mark was carrying a box. The image had been taken from the woods. On the back, written in pencil, were 4 words. "You were never alone." Sarah cried when she saw it. Mark felt something inside him change. The fear had become anger. He was tired of being watched, tired of running, tired of cameras and locks and curtains. He wanted the man caught, not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted the uncertainty to end. The detective warned him not to take matters into his own hands. Mark promised. He meant it. But that night, he made a decision. He would return to the old house, not alone, not without police. He wanted to see the place where this had started. He wanted to understand the layout. If the suspect had been living there for weeks, there might still be something they had missed. The return happened before dawn. Police vehicles surrounded the property. The house looked smaller than Mark remembered. The trees seemed closer. Sarah stayed in the car. Mark entered with the detective. Every room was empty. The crawlspace was sealed. The basement had been stripped of anything the suspect might have used. Mark stood beneath the rear addition and looked at the floor above. He remembered sleeping there, working there, laughing there. He remembered hearing sounds and explaining them away. Then he noticed something. A small panel behind the furnace was slightly crooked. He called the detective. They opened it. Behind it was a narrow cavity. Inside was a bundle of papers, not the notebook. Drawings, sketches, dozens of them. The house, the windows, the bedroom, the kitchen, the rear hallway. There were sketches of Mark and Sarah. Some were rough. Others were detailed enough to show clothing. One drawing showed Sarah sleeping. Another showed Mark working at his desk. Mark felt sick. He turned away. The detective searched the cavity further. There was one final drawing. It showed the house from beneath the trees. In the foreground stood a figure. The figure was watching the windows, but the face wasn't drawn. Instead, the artist had written a date. The date was the day Mark and Sarah had first visited the property. Mark stared at it. He was here when we came to see it. The detective nodded. Looks that way. He saw us before we bought it. Yes. Then he didn't choose us because we moved here. The detective looked at him. Maybe he chose the house. That possibility changed everything. The man may have been using the property long before they arrived. They hadn't been the reason he was there. They had simply interrupted his hiding place. Maybe his obsession had grown because they discovered traces of him. Maybe he had followed them because he feared they would expose him. Or maybe the truth was worse. Maybe he had become attached to them as subjects. The detective found one more clue in the cavity, a torn piece of paper with an address written on it. Mark recognized the street. It was the location of a house where Sarah's illustrations had once been displayed in a local exhibition. It was from before they moved to the Pine Barrens. The detective looked at Mark. "Did you ever see this man there?" Mark shook his head. Sarah entered the room and saw the address. Her face changed. "I know that place." Mark turned. "How?" "The gallery." She looked frightened. "I worked there once." When? 2 years ago." "Did you meet anyone unusual?" She thought for several seconds. "There was a man who used to sit outside." Mark's chest tightened. "What did he look like?" "I don't remember." "Sarah." "I don't." She closed her eyes. "He was always there. Same bench, same jacket maybe. I thought he was waiting for someone." The detective asked whether she had ever spoken to him. "No." "Did he ever approach you?" "Once." Mark looked at her. "What did he say?" Sarah swallowed. "He asked me what time the gallery closed." Silence filled the room. "What did you tell him?" 7. Mark stared at the floor. "That's it. That's it." The detective looked at Mark. "We need to find out whether this is the same person." They did. The detective obtained old security footage from the gallery. It took hours, but eventually they found the man. Sitting on the bench, watching the entrance, the same face, the same hollow cheeks, the same dark coat. He had been there repeatedly, not every day, but often. The pattern suggested he had noticed Sarah long before the house. Mark asked why. The detective couldn't say. Maybe the man had developed an obsession. Maybe he had simply become fascinated by her routine. There was no clear motive, but the timeline was undeniable. He had watched Sarah before they ever moved to the Pine Barrens. Then he watched both of them at the house. Then he followed them to the apartment. This was no longer random squatting behavior. It was stalking. The police issued a formal warning and increased surveillance. They also advised Sarah not to travel alone. The detective said they were close to identifying the suspect's current hiding places, but the man remained elusive. He seemed to know when police were nearby. He avoided obvious routes. He never used the same entrance twice. He moved through forgotten spaces. He watched cameras. He listened to police frequencies. He studied people. The detective believed that if they wanted to catch him, they needed to force him into a situation where observation wasn't enough. So they waited. 3 nights later, Mark received another notification. Not from the apartment, from the old Pine Barrens property. The house had been sold, but the security system was still active during the transition. Motion detected at the cellar door. Mark opened the feed. Snow covered the ground. The exterior light was on. The cellar door was closed. Then the latch moved. Slowly, the door opened 2 inches, then stopped. Mark watched, barely breathing. A hand appeared around the edge. The door opened farther. A figure stepped out. The suspect. He looked directly into the camera. Then he turned toward the house. The police had been waiting for this. Units were already nearby. The detective whispered over the phone, "Stay on the line." Mark watched the screen. The suspect walked across the yard. He stopped beneath the rear window. He looked up. Then he walked toward the woods. Police followed. For the first time, the man was no longer invisible. Officers tracked him through the trees. He knew they were behind him. He didn't run immediately. He moved carefully. using the darkness and terrain. Then he disappeared behind a stand of pines. Police surrounded the area. Searchlights moved between trees. A helicopter joined the search. Mark watched the live feed from the security system. The woods appeared empty. 10 minutes passed. 20. Then an officer found a narrow opening beneath an old fallen tree. It led into a drainage culvert. The suspect had disappeared into it. The culvert connected to an abandoned access road. Police blocked both ends. They waited. Nothing. Then Sarah said, "Mark." He looked at her. "What?" "The camera." She pointed at the screen. The rear camera had changed angle. Not much, just enough. Someone had touched it. The view now included more of the house and less of the trees. Mark's stomach dropped. He was here. The detective heard him. "What?" He moved the camera. The detective went silent. Then he asked, "Where is the camera located?" Mark told him. The detective cursed quietly. "There's a service ladder behind the shed." Mark remembered. He can reach it from the roof. The police moved immediately, but by the time they reached the camera, the suspect was gone again. The next morning, investigators found a message scratched into the underside of the camera housing. 3 words. "You looked back." The detective showed it to Mark. Mark stared at it. "What does that mean?" he asked. The detective shook his head. "I don't know." Sarah did. She remembered the day at the gallery. The man had once approached her and asked what time the gallery closed. She had told him. She had forgotten. He hadn't. He had been learning her schedule for years. They changed their lives permanently after that. They moved to a different state. They chose a townhouse in a dense neighborhood with neighbors on both sides, streetlights outside every window, and people walking dogs late at night. Mark no longer complained about traffic. Sarah kept the curtains open during the day. They installed cameras, but Mark stopped watching them obsessively. He knew cameras could never replace awareness. Months passed. The police continued looking for the suspect. Eventually, there were no new sightings. The old house was sold. The apartment building replaced its locks and sealed its maintenance corridors. The detective occasionally sent updates. Nothing. Then one winter evening, almost a year after they left the Pine Barrens, Sarah found an envelope in the mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph. She called Mark. He came downstairs. The photograph showed their new house from across the street. It had been taken recently. The curtains were open. Their car was in the driveway. Sarah was visible through the window, sitting at her desk. Mark stared at the image. His hands began to shake. On the back was a single sentence written in the same uneven pencil handwriting. "I told you, you were never alone." Mark called the police. They searched the neighborhood. Nothing. They checked every camera. Nothing. They searched the street, the parks, the alleys, the nearby wooded areas. Nothing. The photograph could have been taken hours earlier, or days. There was no way to know. That night, Mark and Sarah sat together in the living room with every light on. Outside, snow began falling. The street was quiet. For once, the silence wasn't the deep, empty silence of the Pine Barrens. There were distant tires on wet pavement. A dog barked somewhere. A neighbor closed a garage door. Someone laughed behind a nearby house. Ordinary sounds. Human sounds. Mark looked toward the window. Sarah noticed. "Don't." He turned to her. "Don't look outside." "Why?" "Because if he's there, I don't want you to know." Mark understood. Looking had become part of the ritual. The watcher watched. The watch searched for the watcher. Every time they looked into the darkness, they gave the darkness their attention. So Mark stayed where he was. They sat quietly. The snow continued falling. At 3 a.m., nothing happened. At 3:27, nothing happened. At 3:15, nothing happened. For the first time in months, Mark began to believe they might actually be safe. Then Sarah's phone vibrated. She looked down. A notification had appeared from the security camera facing the street. Motion detected. Mark looked at her. Neither moved. The phone vibrated again. Motion detected. Then again. Motion detected. Then again. Motion detected. Mark slowly opened the camera feed. The street was empty. Snow covered the sidewalk. The porch light illuminated the driveway. Nothing moved. Then, at the very edge of the frame, behind the neighbor's hedge, a human silhouette appeared. It stood perfectly still. Mark zoomed in. The figure did not approach. It simply stood there, watching the house. Sarah whispered, "Don't look back." Mark stared at the screen. The silhouette slowly raised one hand, not waving, pointing directly at the camera. Then the feed went black. The room remained silent, and somewhere outside, beyond the reach of the lights, a door handle made a very soft, metallic click.